Stand right there so that you can see your head right there.
Right there, okay, there I am. Thank you. There's this really bright light shining in my eyes. Hi, everyone. Some housekeeping stuff before we get started. To prevent chaos online, everyone is muted online. If you have a question, put it in the chat. And Catherine is going to try to collate those questions and ask them to Doug at the end of his presentation. So welcome to Climate Emergency Spring into Action 2024. Spring into Action is a semester-long series of events and activities organized by faculty, staff, students, and community members to raise awareness, provide support, and grow the movement toward a more climate-resilient Kalamazoo. We have listed over 50 events for the semester and are planning a culminating march and rally on April 19th in downtown Kalamazoo from 3 to 5 p.m. So pencil in April 19th and check our website for details as they become available. Today's event is sponsored by the WMU Climate Change Working Group and the Center for the Study of Ethics in Society. So it is my honor to introduce Professor Doug Tallamy, T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Delaware. An insect ecologist, Professor Tallamy is author of almost 100 scholarly publications on the behavior and importance of insects in nature. He's also author of 4 popular books on the importance of preserving native landscapes and, importantly, the role that each of us can play in this critical effort. One of these books, which shares the title with today's presentation, has opened the minds of thousands of people, including me. I have all kinds of plans now after reading his book for what I'm going to do in my woods come spring, which maybe is already here. And I'm just really excited about getting to hear from him directly, getting to hear his take on the ideas that he presents in his book. So thank you for joining us, Doug, and for being part of Spring into Action. And Catherine is now going to run this bus.
Okay, so I should
All
screen
right,
share now.
Hey, just give me 1 minute and I'll let you know when we're ready to go, Doug. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Oh, there's my dog. Okay. Are you sharing your screen, Doug?
No, it says I'm disabled.
Oh, okay. 1 second. All right, go ahead and share.
Okay. There we go.
And there's all my passwords. Okay. 1 second. Easier if you have 2 computers. All right. All right, you are ready to go.
Ready to
Thank you so
go.
much, Doug.
All right, thanks. Thanks for coming, everybody. I do want to talk about nature's best hope today, and I'll give you a spoiler. You're nature's best hope. Not just in fighting climate change. The good news about fighting climate change is that we can fight the biodiversity crisis in exactly the same way at the same time. We can kill 2 crises at the same time. I've got to stop 1 second because I see I have no power to my computer. I'll be back in 30 seconds. All right, now we've got power. That's good news. Okay. So nature's best hope. Let's first talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. He, of course, very famous professor at Harvard, probably the most famous professor at Harvard. It's the late E.O. Wilson. Unfortunately, he died 2 years ago, the day after Christmas. But throughout his very long, successful career, he had one consistent theme, and that was he loved biodiversity, he loved life on Earth, and he tried to save it his entire career, not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. And that was, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it's going to disappear everywhere, and that includes humans. Very bold statement. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature, how we're going to save life on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's just a great idea. We'll put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are disappearing can be in that half. We can be in the other half, and it'll be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And we've got 8 billion people, and all of our hardscape and roadways and airports and detritus in the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how are we going to realize E.O. Wilson's dream? Well, that's really what I want to talk about today. I think we can. But we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, let's talk about what happened in 2019 in the East. And it's actually happened in a lot of places over the country this year. And that is, we had a very large oak mass, particularly in the red oak group. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head. Then it forced its head through there. Then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. And after it leaves the acorn, it's a dangerous time for that insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly, stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, that leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the colony. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They will take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile. Some people say 1.5 miles from the parent tree. And then they tap that acorn below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And a single jay can bury 4,500 acorns each fall. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in bees. We have between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over 1/3 of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all afternoon, all night, all week about nature specialized interactions. The point I want to make, though, is that most of these interactions today, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states anything close to its original pristine ecological condition, and those are largely mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. Got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need to sustain us. And you might wonder why we've done that. I wonder why we've done that, and I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population already gone. And the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they said that 2 years ago, so I guess it's the next 18 years now. Now, that's a prediction, but it's one that we have to make sure does not come to pass because those are the species that keep us alive on this planet. This is serious stuff. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare says, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk's about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me. Those efforts to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Edwin Wade Teal decades ago said, we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's just common sense. It's so logical. For some reason, we can't seem to see that. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects disappeared from Earth, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. Our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And humans, again, wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Now, there is good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But we are going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day, like produce oxygen, pretty important, clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use, carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants, of course, are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon. And they don't stop there. They fix more carbon than they can use, so they pump the extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. And once it's in the ground, it's extremely stable. Plants are building topsoil. They're holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. They're converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and we will all lose weight. What are animals doing for plants? Well, lots of things, but these are important ones. They're providing pest control services. They're pollinating nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They're dispersing plant seeds like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services. Is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. And we do have parks. We have parks and preserves. They're doing the best they can, but it's obviously not good enough because we are now in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced. To me, the answer is obvious. We now need to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together, cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still around, folks. It's still in our own culture. He might not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue today, though, is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Thrive, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year. Where should we start? Well, back to private property. Most of the country's privately owned. 78% of the lower 48 states privately owned, 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. Absolutely. That's been our conservation model for the last century, but it's not good enough. So we now need to go beyond conservation into restoration. We've got to rebuild nature in as many places as we can. And some people say, well, there's no way you're going to put it back together again the way exactly the way it was. They're probably right, but we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions that comprise nature to form functional ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was on a particular landscape at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we need to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most powerful groups, and there's 2 groups that we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is that's the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have the food that animals need stored in plant parts, mostly leaves. If we don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have a functional ecosystem. Well, it turns out most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Caterpillars turn out to be enormously important in terms of transferring energy from plants to other animals. They are transferring more energy from plants to animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes without a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that resides at our house here in Southeast Pennsylvania. You have the black-capped chickadee, practically the same bird doing the same thing. And what they're doing is eating seeds at our feeders all winter long. We tend to think that's all chickadees need is seeds. But even in the wintertime, only 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, they can't eat seeds at all. Their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch to invertebrates. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out the caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. We vertebrates can't make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Well, all those things they bring back to the nest. But look, these first two bars here are caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. Only the caterpillars are eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? One or two a day enough? Well, it's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. But you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to get one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce to the point where they are independent. And of course, after they're independent, they keep eating caterpillars. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think that you do, because in so many places, that's all we have is our yards. You have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all of those caterpillars, that is called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's a Smithsonian group who said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years in North America. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups, the species that require insects and the species that do not require insects, particularly when they're breeding. So things like crossbills and doves and finches can actually make a little milk out of seeds that they eat, and that's what they can rear their young on. So the species that don't need insects didn't decline at all in the last 50 years, but the species that require insects decline on average 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. And look, it's not just birds that require caterpillars. Lots of things do. This is an ornate box turtle. Used to be common in the Midwest. I don't know if you have them up there in Michigan or not, but there are not many left. Let's put it that way. They used to follow armyworm and cutworm populations around and eat hundreds of caterpillars a day. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do two things, be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. And that's not going to happen unless you put the caterpillars back. So how do you add caterpillars to the landscapes? Well, you add the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty straightforward. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to be fussy about which plants we choose to landscape with, and we have to be fussy about it. Caterpillars are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the Bradford pear, Callery pear, all the privet, all the buckthorn, all the hostas, all the ginkgos, all those things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, plants have made them specialized. Plants that want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat the plants for which they have very specialized adaptations that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, those specialized enzymes, behavioral adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, monarch's not going to start to make a living on hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds, and it has two choices: fly away and find milkweeds someplace else, or starve to death. There are three kinds of plants out there: plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor across the country, in 84% of the counties in which they occur, is one of the oaks. It's contributing far more energy to local food webs than any other type of plant. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental tree. It's got good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to the local food web. And a good example of a detractor would be Callery pear, Bradford pear, one of our major invasive ornamentals. Not only is it not passing on a lot of energy, but it doesn't stay where we plant it and becomes a major invasive species everywhere, pushing out the native plants that do contribute energy to local food. So the net result is you lose energy when you have Callery pear. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We're not going to be able to rebuild ecosystems if we don't have functional food webs in those ecosystems, and you will not have functional food webs if you don't use the right plants. And I'm going to give you three examples of how well this works when we do use the right plants, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It's where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000 to a farm, very old farm. It farmed almost 300 years. And they finally sold it, broke it up into 10-acre lots. We got one of those lots. And the last thing they did before they sold it was to mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there. And our job was to put it back together again, which we didn't know how to do. But I did want to see if I could actually attract moth species to our yard by putting in their host plant. Never tried that before. And the first one I tried was the Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen the Canadian owlet. It's a pretty little thing. That's what a Canadian owlet adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. That's their host plant. And we didn't have any meadow rue. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, planted them They grew very nicely. Now, there used to be meadow rue there 100 years ago, hundreds of years ago, before they farmed it to death, but long gone. So my little patch of meadow rue grew very nicely, but this was early on, and I had very little faith that Canadian Alice would appear out of nowhere and find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. And then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over, it was covered with Canadian Alice. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of Canadian Alice and meadow rue. We've added 2 species to the property. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. Excuse me. That beautiful moth actually has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have Biden's aristosa. We didn't have very much, but I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over my front yard. That's okay. Well, I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens. They did. And now we've got a good population of both of these. So we've added 4 species to the restoration. Wanted to see if the hackberry emperor could make a living at our house. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be there. And as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got 3 or 4 hackberry trees. I planted them. I had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry trees, but they did. And now we've got a good population of them as well. So now we've added 6 species, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that use goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I know people don't like that, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It's a good ground cover. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. Makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fat. Our migrating birds seek out sources of fat to fuel that migration. And our overwintering birds need sources of fat to make it through the winter. And these berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know when Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Turns out it's a fantastic pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent to make a living at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy, like a Stegosaurus. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. And of course, we didn't have any American elm. We lost that decades ago to Dutch elm disease. But there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they make a lot of seed. So the second year after we moved in, I gathered up some of the seed from the gutter. Native planting can be cheap. I planted them. They germinate in 6 days. Grow very quickly. Today, those trees are over 80 feet tall. And yes, they brought in the double-toothed prominent. Another big success, American elm. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to make a living at our house. Because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, it needs evening primrose, and we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. And I planted a lot of oak trees. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages that I have put back on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that make the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that's just popped its head above the leaves, and here is a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oaks to start to support the local food web. They will do it right away. It's what our yard looks like in the summertime now, taken from pretty much the same place I took that first picture. Just to give you an idea, we put a lot of plants back. Not all of them, still working on it. But my research has shown over the last couple decades that if you know the number of species of moths in your local food web, moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are bad-tasting, day-flying moths. And because they don't taste very good, that's why they get to fly in the day, so the birds don't care about them. Because they don't taste very good, they're not adding a lot to local food webs. So if you know the number of species of moths that do control those food webs, you have a very good index of how stable your local food web is and how productive it is. In other words, how many species is it supporting? So 6 years ago, I took it upon myself to try to get a picture of every species of moth that's making a living at our house now because we put the plants back. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,259 species of moths that are living on our property because we put those plants back. Now, we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 29.4. I think it's 29.4 million acres. So in one tiny sliver of Pennsylvania, we've got 48% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of them are types of bird food, we've recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why? We've got the bird food. We've got the bird food. So why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. That's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I am convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn around a lot of these terrible headlines around. But here's a good question. We've got 10 acres. Will it work on smaller properties, let's say in suburbia? Well, let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. When they moved into their property, it was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they started counting the birds using their yard. They're still at it, but they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species, an incredible number. Just to compare that to our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. How about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, her property abuts O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America, not connected to any natural area at all. So she is a little island in the middle of Chicago. A pretty island. Pam's a native plant landscaper. She knows how to do it. So the next time somebody says you can't use native plants in an attractive way, show her Pam's house. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature. Then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine, and started counting the birds that are using her property. She's up to 125 bird species that have used her property, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. There are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. We need to succeed in a big way. One of them is we got to talk about those big lawns. Last figure I saw was 44 million acres of lawn in this country. going up, not going down. That's an area bigger than all of New England combined, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, lawn's a status symbol, and we need to display our Halloween decorations, and we need to display our Christmas decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? We're not going to get rid of it. It's a perfect place to walk. It's a good cue for care. Let's cut that area of lawn in half. Let's take spaces like this and turn it into this. I got this picture from Dan Getman. I should get an update. He sent it to me several years ago. He said, look, I've got this great big lawn. I'm planting all of these things. And that's what we're talking about. Well, let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres. We're going to cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres, which is enough to create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badland National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? What do we get when we put some part of nature right where we live? We get the opportunity to interact with that part of nature. All we have to do is go outside. We do it at our own time, our own pace. Maybe all we have to do is look out the window. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 75 people there with you, that's the figure from last year. So I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic or government closure comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. I think the alone's important in terms of developing that unique personal relationship with Mother Nature, not mediated by somebody else. And this is particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids. We put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour, and they go to a natural place. They walk around for an hour. The teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and interact with it, get to know with it, fall in love with it. Alone, no parental supervision. If we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you really should fear. Terrible message to send to the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid to be a steward of the planet, if they don't love stewarding the planet, they will be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of grass with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she learned that, she sent me this picture to describe very seriously how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. Serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of that lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember these interactions that she's had with nature, as modest as they were, the rest of her life. And I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of them. If you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can. It's a real entity now. We got a small nonprofit. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the map. Your location and the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce your lawn. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It doesn't matter how small the effort. And then your little piece of your county is going to light up. You get to see who else in your county, not by name, but how many other people have joined Homegrown National Park. And our goal here is to use this form of social media to get the message that everybody's an essential part of the future of conservation. We want that message to go viral. We want the entire country to light up. What's our mission? It's to regenerate biodiversity by motivating millions of people to plant natives, remove invasives from their property, to reshape their relationship with Mother Nature. What are we asking? We really are asking people to reduce the area of lawn. Lawn doesn't accomplish any of the ecological goals our properties need to accomplish. And we want to put the plants that do accomplish those goals in place of that lawn. We want to remove invasive species. Most people do have invasive plants in their property and they don't even know it. And if you're protecting any natural area, you want to keep doing that. There are real ecological products associated with homegrown national park. Most important one probably is that significant increase in biodiversity. And I look at what's happened at our house. Nature is extremely resilient. If we give it half a chance, it will rebound. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody in the country got rid of the invasive species just on their property, we'd be 78% done. We'd be 85% done in the East. Very good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. If we replace lawn with anything else, particularly planting like this, we're going to sequester a whole lot more carbon than the lawn was. The lawn is the worst choice in terms of sequestering carbon. So we're going to help climate change. And we're going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are also important sociological products from homegrown national park. National awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We want to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, whether you like nature or not. Everybody needs it, which means everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action is better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations that are out there, Audubon and National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones and Sierra Club, and all the land conservancies doing wonderful conservation on private property, but nobody's measuring it. We want to get that recorded on the map. We have a very good measure of how well we're doing towards that 30 by 30 goal. You know, we want to preserve 30% of the country by 2030. Not going to happen unless we record conservation on private property. Homegrown National Park is free. We're not trying to pull membership away from any other organization, so we don't charge anything, which means we're entirely supported by your generation, your generosity, yes, and your generation, which means whether or not we exist is going to be, you know, it depends entirely on your generation. So thank you, and your generosity, geez. Thank you very much. Okay. We're going to reduce the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch, and if you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of that caterpillar food that drives those food webs. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are essential. They're the support system. You can't build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last century with our ornamental plants. What's the best keystone plant? Well, again, in 84% of the counties in which they occur, it's one of our oaks. In the Mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species, over 950 species nationwide. Let's compare an oak to a tulip tree, another good native plant. Tulip trees support 21 species. So there's a huge difference among our native plants, and the keystones led by the oaks need to be part of it. So how do you know what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody plants and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. This changes as you move around the country. It's a much bigger list than this. I ran out of room. So the old excuse of I don't know what to plant is just an excuse now. Go to Native Plant Finder and you do know what to plant. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. Turns out that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines around the country. These are all the ways that light is killing insects at night, particularly the moths that make those caterpillars that run our food webs. But to me, this is good news. It's good news because we have to not just stop insect decline, we got to turn it around. We have to increase insect populations. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick, but there's a lot of us to flick those switches. Right away, I hear, I can't turn the light out over my barn, or over my garage, or over my front porch because the bad man's going to come. Or I put a motion sensor on it, so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you realize is the bad man does not come very often. And if you don't want to do that, even easier, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow LED, yellow incandescent. You can get them at your hardware store now. Yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. It's a very, very easy cure. If we took the white bulbs out of our security lights and put in a yellow bulb overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we used LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. And then we're going to invite a mosquito fogger to come kill all of our insects. This is a booming business around the country. And they say it's okay because what we are fogging it's a natural organic product. It is pyrethroids. And it's true. It's a natural organic product. Pyrethroids are made by chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural organic product. Ricin is a natural organic product. Nicotine is a natural organic product. Just being natural and organic doesn't make it non-toxic. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish they were right about that, but not even close. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with. There's no way you're going to kill an adult mosquito without killing the other insects that it touches, including monarchs. This is a result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island in the Chesapeake. My friend was there, picked up a handful of dead monarchs, but there were thousands of dead monarchs. This was during a migration event. It's killing all the pollinators that we're trying to save. It makes no sense. It makes no sense because it does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. These kill between 10 and 50%, so they're not even close to getting good control. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, put it out in the sun for a few days to build up the population of diatoms and algae, because that is what mosquito larvae eat. This becomes an irresistible brew to adult female mosquitoes in your yard. They will preferentially lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks, $12 for a season's worth of control. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic dipteran in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's targeted, it's cheap, and if everybody did it, it would work. This works too, by the way. Get a fan, put it on your picnic table, and you can have your drinks in the afternoon there. Sit in the directed breeze. Mosquitoes don't fly into a directed breeze, so you get to enjoy your yard without killing anything. All right, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development, particularly under the trees those caterpillars developed on. So what am I talking about? This is an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches. Then it emerges as an adult. Then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish all the species did that, but most of them don't. 94% of them finish growing on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil surface to pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact the area under our tree so that it's rock hard, particularly in the summertime, making it very difficult for those caterpillars to get underground and pupate. These are oak trees. This is going to be an ecological trap. They're calling it adults to lay their eggs on these leaves.
Okay.
Caterpillars will develop, and then they drop down, and chances are good that they will die. So I think that the way we landscape under our trees is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You've got a tree in a yard. I've got a grad student now, Emma Jonas, measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a layered landscape. Caterpillars drop down out of the tree. This is called soft landing. You know, they're native plants. They drop down. There's a lot of leaf litter under here. The soil is not compacted by mowers or you. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to step on them. There'll be much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. You put beds around your trees. The bigger, the better. Your tree will love it, and so will those caterpillars. Use the available ground covers, native ground covers like wild ginger. This is native pachysandra. There's the Virginia creeper acting as a ground cover. Golden seal, mayapple, foam flower, ferns. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. Green mulch is the way to go. Again, your tree will love it, and so will those caterpillars. Former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news. She had one simple question: how well do chickadee populations do in suburban landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by typical introduced ornamentals? And when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, everybody had a nest box up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all those data into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. So anything above this dotted line here, and that's what you have when you have very few non-native plants. But if you're below the line, which you are when you have a lot of non-native plants, you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Now, right here is where those lines overlap, liberally speaking, which means you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web, because they're ecological tumors. They don't stop growing, and they don't stay where you plant them. But there are a lot of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? Remember this here? I don't know if you picked it up. That's a ginkgo tree. Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native planting? Well, Dan's wife likes ginkgos, and Dan likes his wife. So he planted a ginkgo. The question is this plant going to destroy the productivity of this landscape? No, it's just there. It's not contributing anything. It's just there. Is it going to escape and become an invasive species in the nearest woodlot? No. It's just there. So I like to think of plants that are just there, not contributing, as if they're statues. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. Is that plant wrecking the productivity here? No, it would if all these guys were statues, but it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys those food webs. It's the absence of the productive native plants, the contributors. If we increase the percentage of these, we can tolerate many of these. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You do not get more formal than that. And every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If Europeans can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Sure, you put a little fence around it, formalizes it. It tells your neighbor it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media will tell you we only need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. which isn't even right. They pollinate about 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators, and we need them everywhere we need plants because they're pollinating 80% of all plants, not just our crops, and 90% of all flowering plants. How about this? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life here compared to the amount of life here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it for a while now. They got a cost-sharing program that is paying homeowners to replace or reduce their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program now. There's an island off Florida where they're paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals like Callery pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina got a bounty on it. If you take out a Callery pear, you get a free tree replacement. Water utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs, particularly in California, this has gone up now. For every square foot of lawn you remove, you get a $3 rebate. You got to replace it with a xeric planting. And if you want more information on all those programs, memorize that. All right, I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one is important. It's going to be more important every day. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. It's not essential. You know, the Congress has labeled the budget for our national park system as non-essential. And we like nature. We like to bird watch. We like to go walking, just sit and enjoy it. But it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, then nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife, so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. Beautiful places, we want to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about that, but if we restrict our conservation efforts just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too small, too few, and too isolated. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to put glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors, allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all those places we've destroyed them. This is starting to happen. It really is starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans really have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to a few specialists, a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every single person on the planet. But I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Why wouldn't they bear the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We're very good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations for good Earth stewardship. It does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living. but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people recognize every day that the earth has some serious issues, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can modify their light system. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person could use keystone plants. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can put in or remove the invasive species from their yard. One person can do a lot to revitalize the ecosystem on their property and then enhance their greater local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence, the piece of the earth that you can actually see results on. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. And I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. And I want to leave you with the Homegrown National Park Challenge. I'm going to challenge each one of you to plant one keystone plant this year. I don't care where you plant it. One keystone plant this year. It will take you 5 minutes. And you might say, well, gee, that's not a big ask. That's not going to accomplish anything. I'm asking 400,000 people to do that, and that will accomplish a lot. So thanks very much. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Doug. I'm just gonna do a little bit of screen manipulation here, but if we have any questions from our in-person audience, we have about 20 people here in person, and then we'll also take questions in the chat from our virtual audience. But is there a question from the in-person audience? Yeah, Steve.
So I have a bunch of keystone oak trees on my property. And the only caterpillar I saw last year was a spongy moth.
Oh, okay.
You've got spongy moths in Michigan? Oh, dear.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Yes.
Okay. Right.
You know, I hear this a lot. You've got more than that. Go out at night and look with a flashlight. During the day, those caterpillars are hiding from you because if you can find them, so can the birds, and they disappear real fast. Now, if you got a really bad spongy moth problem, they can actually strip your tree, and that'll certainly reduce the number of caterpillars. But typically, the best time to look for caterpillars is the end of July, early August. Don't look in the spring because that's when the birds are feeding their young and they've taken them all. And look at night, and you'll do much better.
All right. Nighttime investigations for non-spongy moths. All right.
Kill the spongy moths.
And kill the spongy moths. All right. So we should have the ability to ask questions through Zoom. Folks on Zoom, if you'd like to raise your hand or put a question into the chat, more ideally, that would be what we'd like.
The chat is currently disabled.
Uh-oh.
Okay, well,
Should have been on all along.
go ahead and raise your hands then. Let's see any raised hands.
Someone did. There was briefly a message with Simon.
Oh,
I don't know why it's not showing up.
I don't even
no.
know how your
Well, these are
computer.
great questions.
I'd like to know what the keystones are for Michigan, for our area. This
Well,
is
that's what that native plant finder's for. Put in your zip code and they'll pop up for your county specifically.
I have a question. This is Judy Nettleton. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So we have a lot of deer in our area. Would I be foolish to try and plant a native area without a fence around it?
Well, I don't want to tell you not to plant native plants, but the deer are a terrible problem. They do eat the natives way before they eat the non-natives. It's one of the reasons we've got an invasive species problem, is because they've tipped the competitive balance against our natives. What I do, we've got 10 acres. We don't fence the whole thing, but I have cages, make wire cages out of that, the wire screen stuff you can get at Home Depot. It's about 5 feet tall. I
Okay,
stake it in with a rebar. I made those cages, 20 years ago. I am still using those cages. I can move them around when the plant gets big enough. So they last forever, and they'll keep the deer out. But you're right. If you don't protect your native plants, the deer eat them. So the solution is to not accept that. We need to control our deer. They're devastating our natural areas, and they're keeping you from enjoying your natives.
yes. All right. Thank you, Doug.
Mm-hmm.
Can't control your deer with a population against control.
All right, we got to control our population then.
Yes.
We got to educate them. I hear people say, well, the analogy I always use is when the Fed sets its interest rates, they do not consult me. They do it all on their own because they're the experts. Why do we allow the public, which has no ecological training, to make ecological decisions? I don't understand that.
All right. The chat should be enabled at this point. So if folks could,
Again, Berger raised hand.
thank you. Yeah. The chat should be enabled at this point. If I could see it, that would be great. Could folks please type their name into the chat instead of using the hand raise function? And in the meantime, it looks like we do have a question here and in the live audience. Yeah, go ahead. Nice and loud.
Well, think about the larva dropping from the tree, and it's under the trees. And, I'm wondering what time of year that most likely happens, because I have this issue with, we have a lot of trees, a lot of oaks, some walnuts in particular, lots of leaves in the fall. We live in the lake community, so everyone's like, your lawns look like golf, like golf spaces. Really crazy about keeping everything picked up. So I'm out there, I was mulching my leaves, instead of raking them up and burning them like they're doing, I was mulching my leaves with my lawnmower, my electric mower, very, fastidiously, trying to use chop the mulch. And then I read an article that says it made me think that I'm actually chopping up some of the caterpillars and larvae in doing that. So I'm like, oh no, I don't want to do that. I have a pollinator garden, we have rain gardens, we have, we're the ones in the neighborhood that have lots of native plants, lots of. So I'm wondering how best for me to take care of all my leaves that drop and still protect these larvae, these caterpillars that I just found out are dropping from the trees into the ground.
Yeah.
I know you talked about the plantings around the tree, which I like that idea. I kind of started that. So you have any other suggestions?
So Doug, were you able to hear that? You want me to repeat the summary?
Repeat the crux of it. I heard some of it. Chopping up leaves chops
Sure.
up caterpillars. Yes.
How do you best
I can repeat it. Yeah, thanks. So it's how do you best deal with leaves and do sort of a leave the leaves technique, but what if you mulch them up? Is that a bad thing? Should you just leave them intact? What is your recommendation?
Well, anything that runs through a lawnmower is going to be killed, and there's a lot of things living in your leaves. We have 70 species of moths we call litter moths, where the caterpillars actually eat the dead leaves. If you have to mulch them as soon as they fall, before things actually get comfortable in there. But in my view, you don't have to mulch them. Rake them into those beds under your trees. The leaf litter is an excellent way to expand your beds. If you pile it up in the grass under your trees, that's how you kill the grass, and then you can plant right through it. And once it rains, it gets matted down a little bit, then it doesn't blow around. But I know you have to get it off your lawn, but remember, you're going to have less lawn, so that's a great way to expand your flower beds. But there are parts of your yard that you may have to mulch it just for aesthetic reasons. life is full of trade-offs. That's one of them, but
So when, also wanted to know what time of year do the caterpillars tend to drop? Is it over the entire growing season?
yep.
Yep.
There are caterpillars that drop early in the spring, right through the summer, even into the fall. So there's no one time when it's safe to do something. They're using the resource all year long.
All right. So folks online, you're welcome to use the chat. You should have that option at this point. Be able to use the chat. You can type a question into the chat.
Chat is still disabled.
All right. Well, go ahead and raise your hand then. Help me out, audience, to see if you see anybody raising their hand. Jean Swander, you want to go ahead and ask your question? Just go ahead and unmute yourself, Jean, and then ask your question. All right, let's move to Rebecca Pollins, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, actually, I just joined very late and wonder how I can get the recording.
It will be posted on the Climate Emergency Spring into Action website.
Thank you.
Yeah. Marianne Laurel, do you want to go? Go ahead and unmute, Marianne. All right. Is there anybody in the in-person audience who would like to ask a question? Yeah, Michelle, go ahead, nice and loud.
So, in terms of thinking about light pollution, besides going up to my neighbor who just seemed to have introduced a whole bunch of nighttime lighting, they just moved in. Are there other things that I could do on my property to help reduce the light pollution that is coming from the neighbor?
It's coming from the neighbor. That's a tough one. The Dark Skies people, the Dark Skies Initiative, have been working with this for a long time. Maybe, your neighbor's light is a huge problem. So we're trying to get top-down regulations that say there have to be shields over the light, so it forces the light straight down. That helps a lot. Changing those bulbs helps a lot. People just don't have any idea how harmful it is. I don't know, sneak the website to your neighbor so they can look at the harmful. They've got great statistics about the amount of carbon we're pumping into the skies for no reason. Your neighbors are a big problem. Telling them they're not living right is probably not the solution, but
I thought you were going to suggest sneaking in a different light bulb, but
well, you can try that, see if that works. Yeah.
all right. Right.
I mean, that's the same problem with the neighbor who has mosquito foggers, because that fogging floats over and kills your insects too. So
Yeah. All right, Rebecca Pollins, you still have your hand up. Do you have another question?
And your book.
There you go.
Or Jean Swander, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Bought a house recently, and it has a spare lot next door to me that came with the house, and so far it's just all grass, so I've been mowing it. My question is, there used to be an old house sitting there, so there's a lot of foundation stuff just under the surface, and it's really, really heavy clay. Can you suggest natives that might do well in heavy clay, or do I have to amend the soil in order to get things to grow?
yeah, no, don't amend the soil. You've got to go with what's there. And what you should do is ask the Google what plants in Michigan do well in clay, and there's a whole list of them. Any of the bottomland plants typically do well in clay. There are oaks that do well in clay, and I think bur oak is one of them. But you want to check that out. There, you go with the conditions you have rather than trying to change them. Start your plants small, tiny, so that they can grow their roots around all that junk, and they're pretty good at doing that. And you should be able to get some plants in there.
Great, thanks.
I wanted to add to that to help out. There's a couple of books that I strongly recommend for people gardening in Michigan. This is called Native Plant Gardening for Birds, Bees, and Butterflies for the Upper Midwest. And then there's a book about using native plants to restore community by Tom Small and Nancy Culberth Small. So these are two excellent books for just in this area. If you're looking for plants, they have all kinds of planting criteria as well. Jim Jensen, why don't you go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, I missed part of the presentation, so you might have already answered this, but is there a way to get a copy of this presentation that I could actually share with others?
It's a lot of it.
Yeah,
It's,
it will. Go ahead, Doug.
yeah, it's recorded, so you can get the whole thing and
Yeah,
show it to anybody.
It is being recorded, and the link will be posted to the Climate Emergency Spring into Action website that you registered on that website to attend this event.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You know, one approach to those neighbor issues is to invite your neighbor to watch this talk. You don't have to, use some of that social capital you might have. Just say, let's have a fun evening watching this crazy man. And let them decide on their own. If you can do that, it might help out.
All right. Yeah. Go back.
Yeah, I'm wondering about spring ephemerals. I just saw my first spring ephemeral popping up in the woods across the street. I'm wondering what you have to say about that type of plant.
Okay.
For the early pollinators? I don't know.
Okay, the question was about spring ephemerals and what information you might have to share about spring ephemerals and if there are early pollinators that they help promote. Is that your question?
There are spring beauties have a specific, there's a bee that only pollinates spring beauties. They don't have a whole bunch. Like goldenrod supports, 12, 13, 14 species of specialist bees, but there are specialist bees on all of those spring ephemerals. And the early season bees always have an issue getting enough pollen. One of the most important early season plants is actually native willows because they bloom very early, and the Caletes ground nesting bees depend on them. But so any of the things that bloom early on, you're helping the pollinators.
Yeah. All right, Mary Ann Laurel, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I was having difficulty before. We had a winter seed sowing demonstration where we planted in milk jugs, and we did that at the end of February or the beginning of February. And now with the warm weather, I'm worried if we'll have enough cold for stratification for those seeds. And then that made me think about our gradually increasing warm weather and wondering about the stratification that's needed in these seeds to create the plants that we're trying to plant for the, for everything. So,
yeah, well, what were those seeds doing from, say, October on? Because there was a lot of cold weather before the end of February. If they were indoors, you started your stratification quite late. It'd be much better to start it in November or December so that you actually have, 60, 90 days of stratification. If it gets so warm that our seeds don't germinate anymore, we're all going to be in real big trouble. So let's just hope it doesn't get that bad. What's really happening with climate change is increased climate variability, where we have these big swings. It still gets really cold, but then it gets warm, and then it gets cold, and then it gets warm. So we're hoping that our plants can adapt to that, but there are still cold periods enough to break that dormancy. I suspect keep those, you're not through with wintertime. I know it seems like it, but keep them out there, and I think your stratification will work.
All right, Rebecca Pollins, do you have another question? Your hand is still raised. Go ahead and unmute if you have a question. Okay, yeah, there's one here in the live audience then, so go ahead.
I have an old farm property, and the last 10 years, we kind of stopped mowing it, thinking that nature would return, but what has returned is a lot of Bradford pears. So we've taken some down by hand and painted them with tricolor. But we're kind of checking with some tree places they have these machines that just come in and gobble them all up, it sounds like. So I just wondered what your thought is on that, and then hopefully to replace that with some good plants.
Okay, so is the question how to get rid of them? Best?
What he suggests of how to get rid of them, what to use.
Okay, how would you get rid of Bradford pear best? And then what would you replace them with?
Yeah. Yeah, I heard most of that.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we can't let nature take its course anymore because of the load of invasive plants that we have. So now you got a huge problem. You can saw them off at the base, paint the trunk with an herbicide. If you don't kill the root systems, they will come back forever. What you want, and you've got to decide what you want that property to become. It wants to be a forest, probably. I'm not, the reason we had oak savannas in the past is we also had fire regime. So you could burn it regularly and get a few oaks in there, recreate an oak savanna, that'd be great. But if you don't want to do that, it's going to return to forest. I support addition by subtraction. Natives will come in too. So you leave what you want and you take out what you don't want. So you never actually have to plant something. You can if you want. But you have to control those invasives as they come in. It is very easy to get rid of a Bradford pear that germinates that year. You get your little hand whacker, your little teeny matic, and boom, and it's gone. And you can cover a lot of area very quickly. If you let them become a big tree, much bigger challenge. So this is part of us having to garden the world now because we brought in all these plants. It is an issue. One thing that I always suggest to people, I don't know if anybody's ever done it, but you can hire a college student during the summer, or maybe a high school student when they're older, and say your job is to get rid of these pears, and you have the whole summer to do it. I'm going to pay you $3,000 or $4,000, which is probably cheaper than if you get that big machine and try to take them all out. And that's all that guy does. He goes around and he does it. And you'd be surprised how fast they can actually do that. Drag all the bodies away, pile them up. It's very effective and pretty cheap. And it gives kids a good amount of employment. So give that a try.
All right, other questions? Are we done?
Well, this is,
I actually do have a question now. This is Rebecca.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, mine has invasive bittersweet. And I think that they'd even be open to doing something about it, but where do you start with that? It's big, it's been there for years, and it's everywhere.
Yeah. One of the worst. And I have tried controlling it without herbicide, and I failed miserably. You saw it off at the base and you paint that trunk. If you don't do it, it comes up at 1,000 different places from a very, very large root system. Once you don't have to pull it out of the trees. If you saw it off, it actually degrades very quickly, but you've got to kill the root system or it will never, ever go away.
Any suggestion for what herbicide to use? I actually what you said a few years ago, and some of it died, but it's still.
Yeah. You want an oil-based herbicide. I use Garlon. Roundup or glyphosate is not designed as a stump paint, so you get a lot of regrowth. And I like stump painting as opposed to spraying because you hit a lot of non-targets with spraying. You have to use a lot more material. With stump painting, you use very little bit material. So I use Garlon.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think the fact that Steve is lurking in the background behind me is indicating that we're almost done, but I have the microphone, so I'm gonna ask a question. So I was curious. I'm a big fan of your work, Doug, and a lot of what you are talking about is something that I do in my own property, and I'm very excited to look into the resources you shared. How do you feel about things like no mow May and leave the leaves initiatives? Because I've had a lot of these conversations with my neighbors, no mow May is in the month of May, you don't mow your lawn, and it's supposed to encourage insects, but that's part of a conversation of then you also should put in some native plants. How do you feel about those types of initiatives?
Their heart is in the right place, but we need no mow areas. Not mowing in May takes short season cool season European grasses and makes it tall, cool season European grasses. It doesn't support pollinators at all unless you have a terrible lawn with a lot of weeds in there. But even if that's true, let's say you've got your dandelions and your clover and everything else, and you don't mow it for a month, and then you do mow it, you've created pollinator populations and then cut them off at the knees. You removed everything they needed. Pollinators aren't around for a month, they're around for the whole season. So it's the right idea, but the wrong execution. Create areas you're never going to mow and plant them with plants that will support those pollinators from March all the way to early November. That's the goal if you really want to help pollinators.
Great.
And leave the leaves. I'm all for leaving the leaves, but you want to leave them where you're really going to leave them. In the middle of your yard. See, part of reducing the area of lawn is to do it in an attractive way so you don't get thrown out of your neighborhood. We've got to mow the lawn we maintain, and if you leave the leaves everywhere, then people get upset with you. So we're going to have less lawn, and you put those leaves in beds.
All right. Great advice. Thank you. I believe
I get the last word.
Steve gets the last word. So I'll turn it over to
Yeah,
Steve.
Doug, thank you so much for giving your time and for your ideas and your patience with our technical challenges here. Just wanted to announce I'm also involved in an organization called Hope for Creation that tries to encourage peoples of faith and houses of worship to live their values. And so if anyone has not gotten their fill of Doug's work, we are hosting a book discussion of Nature's Best Hope on March 20th, where we will have an opportunity to dig in more about some of the details that he has presented in that book. So it's a shameless plug. If you want to know more, come talk to me afterwards or send me an email. But even if he can't hear it, I guess it's fairly traditional. Let's give Doug another round of applause. Thank him for
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
for joining us. Thank you so much.
Okay. I enjoyed it. Good luck to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks.
Bye.
Fun.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
I recently joined the Fearless Garden Club.